The letter hit the floor of the sheriff's office like a stone thrown into still water, and Pauline Bristol stood over it with her hands shaking so badly she could not have picked it up again if her life depended on the attempt. Wallace Mercer did not move from his chair behind the desk. He sat very still, the way a man sits when something inside him has already broken, and he is only now waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to the fact of it. "You knew," she said. The words were not a question. They were a verdict. "Pauline, you knew that my land deed was forged. You knew who forged it. You knew for how long." The silence that followed was the most devastating answer he could have given her, because silence meant weeks, and weeks meant she had been building a life on top of a lie, while the one man she trusted more than any living soul in the whole of Crane County had been standing at the foundation of that lie and saying nothing. She had trusted Wallace Mercer with everything. Every widow in Redemption trusted him with something. Every merchant, every family that had pushed a wagon across the Llano Estacado and landed broken and bone-tired in the shadow of the Davis Mountains in the West Texas heat of 1882. People said he was the most dependable man in the territory. They said it the way they said the sun rises east, as simple fact, as the kind of thing that needed no decoration. But she had been the only one, the only single person among all of them who had ever looked Wallace Mercer in the eye and said those words directly to him. She had meant them. She had meant them so thoroughly that the meaning of them now felt like a blade turned inward. "How long?" she asked again. He stood up slowly. He was a tall man, lean in the way the desert makes men lean, with hands that had stitched fence wire and pulled drowning calves into the world, and once, on a February night she would never forget, had held her face when she wept over a grave she'd had no one else to stand beside. Those hands were at his sides now, open, and she hated that they looked so honest even now. 3 weeks, he said. "I have known for 3 weeks." She left the office without another word, walked straight out into the white-blazed Texas afternoon, and the door swung shut behind her with a sound like a rifle shot. She had come to Redemption, Texas in the spring of 1881, arriving on the stage line from San Antonio with a carpetbag, a surveyor's map, and a legal document that bore the signature of a land office clerk named Hector Vane. The document said that 160 acres of grazing land north of the Crane County seat had been lawfully transferred to one Pauline Bristol of Bixar County, following the death of her uncle, Arthur Bristol, who had homesteaded the land in 1876 under the provisions of the General Preemption Act. The document looked legitimate. It had a territorial seal. It had 2 witness signatures below Hector Vane's own. It had everything a legal deed was supposed to have. What it did not have was any grounding in truth. Pauline did not know that when she arrived. She knew only that she was 26 years old, that she had been employed as a seamstress in a San Antonio dress shop for 4 years following her mother's death, and that the inheritance of land represented the first real thing she had ever owned. Her uncle Arthur had been a distant man who wrote her exactly 3 letters in her lifetime, each one shorter than the last, but he had remembered her in the end, and that had felt like something close to grace. She had met Wallace Mercer on her 3rd day in Redemption. She had been standing outside the land registry office on Crockett Street with her deed in her hand, trying to make sense of a discrepancy she had noticed between the surveyor's description in the document and the physical landmarks the registry clerk had described to her. The numbers did not line up. She was not a woman who ignored numbers that did not line up. "You look like a woman with a mathematical problem," said a voice behind her. She turned. He was leaning against the post outside the barbershop next door, arms crossed, hat tilted against the sun. He wore a deputy's star on his chest, though it was pinned at a slight angle, as if it had been put on in a hurry and then forgotten about. "I have several mathematical problems," she said. "The least of which is that the boundaries described in this document would put my property line 30 feet inside Emmett Craddock's cattle operation." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed off the post and walked over and looked at the document she was holding, not touching it, just reading. He had gray eyes the color of creek water after rain, and he read the way careful men read, without rushing. Emmett Craddock's east fence moved 6 months ago, he said. It moved in a direction it wasn't supposed to move. The land registry's reference points haven't been updated to reflect that, which is a problem that belongs to the registry, not to you. She looked at him. And you know this because I'm the one who told Craddock his fence was on someone else's land, and he moved it with such reluctance that I had to stand there in the sun for 4 hours watching him do it. She had laughed. She had not expected to laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes out of a person before they have time to decide whether it is appropriate, a real laugh, unguarded and grateful. "Deputy," she said. "Wallace Mercer," he said, and held out his hand. She shook it. "Pauline Bristol. Welcome to redemption, Miss Bristol. It's a better town than it sounds." That first meeting had planted something in her that she could not have named at the time. It was not yet love. It was something quieter and more structural, the way a cornerstone is not the whole building, but is the thing without which the building cannot stand. She had felt, in that brief exchange, the particular relief of encountering a person who was precisely what they appeared to be. In her experience, that was rarer than gold. She had spent her first 6 months on the property working harder than she had ever worked in her life. She had no husband. She had no brothers. She had one hired hand, a 60-year-old Mexican man named Celestino Rios, who could fix anything made of wood or leather but whose knees had given out years ago, and who could not be asked to ride the fence lines. She did the riding herself. She got up before dawn and was in the saddle by the time the eastern sky turned the color of a bruised plum, and she rode until the light failed. She pulled cedar posts out of rocky ground with a hand winch she had ordered from a catalog. She learned to recognize the sound a water pipe makes when it is about to blow. She learned that a horse will tell you more about the weather than any barometer if you know how to listen. Wallace came by the property with regularity that was professional in its stated purpose, and she gradually began to suspect, personal in its actual motivation. He came to check on a reported fence dispute with her northern neighbor, a taciturn man named Doyle Fitch, and stayed 3 hours helping her repair a section of split-rail fencing that had nothing to do with the dispute. He came to inform her that the town was holding a meeting about water rights from the Pecos tributary, and stayed to help her move her small herd of 6 cattle out of a draw where a flash flood was threatening, working beside Celestino in the dark with a lantern and calm, quiet authority. He never stayed past what was appropriate. He never gave her a reason to object to his presence. But the presence itself was becoming something she thought about in the hours when he was not there, which was most hours, which made the thinking both persistent and inconvenient. "People talk about you," she told him one evening in early autumn, when they were sitting on the porch steps of her small stone house watching the sun go down over the mountains. She had made coffee. He was holding the tin cup with both hands. He glanced at her. "People in this territory talk about everything. They say you're the most dependable man around. Mrs. Horace at the feed store said it. Old Franklin Price at the livery said it. Even Doyle Fitch said it, and that man does not appear to issue compliments willingly." He was quiet for a moment in the way she had come to recognize as his genuine quiet, not discomfort, not evasion, just the pause of a man who takes things seriously. "People say a lot of things," he said at last. "I believe it," she said. "That's the difference. They say it and I believe it." He turned and looked at her in the last of the gold light, and something in his expression shifted in a way she had not seen before, something that was not quite surprise and not quite pain, but was in the territory between the two, as if belief from her in particular was something he had not prepared himself to receive. She had meant every syllable. What she did not know, sitting on those steps in the warm September dark with the smell of cedar and dust and distant rain in the air, was that a man named Gerald Voss had been living with a secret in redemption for going on 2 years, and that the secret was about to crawl out of the ground like something that had been buried alive. Gerald Voss was the largest rancher in Crane County. He ran 1,200 head of cattle on a spread that stretched from the southern edge of the Davis Mountains to the bank of an unnamed creek that the county maps called simply Bristol Creek, because Arthur Bristol had named it that when he filed his original homestead claim in 1876. Arthur Bristol had been the first man to sink a permanent well in that particular stretch of land, and the creek had been rechristened by usage and affection in the years since. Arthur Bristol had also, inconveniently for Gerald Voss, died before he could legally expand his original homestead claim to include an additional parcel of land that sat directly between Voss's main grazing range and a water source that would have made Voss's operation dramatically more profitable. The parcel was Arthur's to claim by right of first settlement and continuous use, but the paperwork had not been completed before his heart gave out. Hector Vane, the land office clerk in San Antonio, had been in Gerald Voss's pocket for the better part of a decade. When Arthur Bristol died and left his original 160 acres to his niece in San Antonio, Voss had seen opportunity in the gap. He had Vane forge a deed that included the contested parcel as part of the legitimate Bristol inheritance. The plan, as Voss designed it, was elegant in its corruption. Pauline Bristol would arrive in redemption with a deed that included land she had not actually inherited. She would attempt to develop and occupy that land. Voss would then challenge the deed in court, reveal the forgery of the parcel addition, use that revelation to cast doubt on the entire document, and claim the full 160 original acres as well, on the grounds that a fraudulent deed voided all property rights attached to it. He would use the very forgery he had commissioned to destroy the woman it was supposed to help. The trouble was that the scheme required Pauline Bristol to be ignorant and isolated and unable to mount a legal defense. And Pauline Bristol was turning out to be none of those things. Wallace Mercer had been the first person to find the thread. He had been going through old land records in the county seat for an entirely different case, a boundary dispute between two brothers on the South Range, when he noticed the filing discrepancy. The dates on Pauline's deed did not align with the land office's internal transfer log. More specifically, the parcel addition had been filed under a date stamp that post-dated Arthur Bristol's death by 11 days, which was impossible if Arthur had been the one to file it. He had sat with that information for a night. Then he had ridden to San Antonio himself on a Tuesday in late October and spent 2 days in the land office archives. He had come back with the confirmation that made his stomach turn cold. The deed was partially forged. The original 160 acres were legitimate. The additional parcel, the one that sat along the creek, had been added by someone after Arthur's death, under Arthur's signature, which meant the signature was a lie. He knew what it meant for Pauline. He also knew, because he was a careful man who had been a lawman in the West Texas Territory for 9 years, that moving too fast would give Voss time to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and potentially accelerate his own legal challenge before Pauline had any protection in place. He needed to build a case that was airtight before he moved. He told himself that was why he waited. He told himself the delay was strategic, professional, necessary. He did not allow himself to think too carefully about whether he was also afraid that when Pauline knew, she would look at him the way she was looking at him now. Standing in the middle of Crockett Street, with the afternoon heat pressing down on her like a judgment, with her eyes gone sharp and flat and unreachable, with everything he had built over 18 months of showing up and being steady, and telling himself that what he felt for her was something he could afford to carry quietly forever. The way she had looked at him when she said those words on the porch had wrecked something in him that he had been maintaining through pure discipline. She had said she believed he was dependable, that she meant it in a way the others did not. He had understood with a clarity that was almost painful that she saw something specific in him, not the badge, not the usefulness, but the man himself. And he had thought, sitting in the dark with the coffee growing cold in his hands, that a man in his position had no right to the kind of happiness her voice suggested when she looked at him. He had been wrong to wait. He knew that now with the certainty of a man watching a door close on something irretrievable. He gave her 2 days, not because he thought 2 days was enough, not because he believed time would make any of it less terrible. He gave her 2 days because he knew Pauline Bristol well enough by now to know that she needed the space to think before she could hear anything, and because he had things to do in those 2 days that could not wait. He rode to the county judge's office and filed a formal complaint against Hector Vane and Gerald Voss. He sent a telegram to the Federal Land Office in Austin. He collected the documents he had assembled in San Antonio into a packet that he sealed and registered at the post office as evidence. He did everything a responsible deputy should have done 3 weeks earlier. Then he went to her property. Celestino let him in at the gate without a word, which told him either that Pauline had said nothing to the old man or that Celestino was the kind of loyal who would let in the enemy just to watch what happened next. Pauline was at the far end of the front field, pulling wire. She had seen him coming and had not stopped working, which he took as permission to approach and hostility in equal measure. He tied his horse to the gate post and walked out to her across the field, through the dry grass and the smell of red dust and iron, and he did not give a speech. He did not have a speech. He had only the truth which he had been carrying for 3 weeks, and he put it down in front of her the way you put down something heavy that has been damaging your spine. He told her everything. The land office records, San Antonio, the dates, Hector Vane, Gerald Voss, and the scheme he had reconstructed from the documents. He told her what her original deed covered and what it did not, and he told her that the original 160 acres were legitimate, and that the additional parcel was the contested ground. He told her about the filings he had made that morning and the telegram to Austin and the evidence packet. He told her he was sorry. He told her he should have come to her within the week of finding out, not at the end of the 3rd week, and that the time he had taken to build the legal case was a partial truth and not a complete one. She listened to all of it without interrupting him. She had stopped pulling wire. She stood with the pliers in one hand and the wire in the other, and she listened the way she did everything, with her full attention turned on him like light through a lens. When he finished, the quiet between them lasted long enough that he could hear a hawk circling somewhere above the property. "The additional parcel," she said finally. "The creek land. Is it mine? By right, by original homestead usage, is it mine? I believe it is. I believe Arthur was going to file for it and that Voss knew it and moved to corrupt the process after his death. You'd need a lawyer and a judge who isn't in Voss's pocket, but yes, I believe it's yours." Voss's plan was to use the forgery he created to take everything. Yes. She set the pliers down on the ground very carefully, as if she were putting down something fragile. She straightened up and looked at him with those eyes that had always seemed to him to see more than was comfortable for a man who had things he was not saying. "Why did you wait 3 weeks, Wallace?" He had known the question was coming. He had rehearsed a version of the strategic answer that was partly true. He did not give it. "Because I was afraid of what it would do to what's between us," he said. "And because I was wrong to let that matter more than your right to know." The silence after that was different from the first one. It was not the silence of anger holding itself still. It was the silence of something being weighed. "What is between us?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. The sun was falling toward the western ridge and the light had gone amber and long, the kind of light that the West Texas late afternoon turns on you like a revelation. "Everything I've got," he said. "Which I know is not a simple thing to hand someone, and I know you didn't ask for it, and I know this is possibly the worst timing in the recorded history of bad timing." She picked up the pliers. She went back to the wire. He stood there for a moment, unsure whether he had just been dismissed. "Go deal with Voss," she said, without looking up. "Then come back." He went. Gerald Voss was not a man who surrendered gracefully. He was 61 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered into permanent displeasure, and he had been operating in Crane County by a combination of legal pressure and informal intimidation for long enough that the habits of dominance had calcified in him. When Wallace arrived at the Voss Ranch house with the county judge's formal complaint notice, and a federal agent from Austin who had arrived by the morning stage, Voss's initial response was to try to throw them both off his property. The federal agent's name was Sutter, and he was a quiet, long-faced man from Virginia who had been a federal land fraud investigator for 11 years, and who reacted to being threatened with ejection the way a stone reacts to being pushed, which is to say he did not react at all. "Mr. Voss," Sutter said pleasantly, "the federal government of the United States would like you to come with us to the county seat, where we have some questions about your relationship with a land office clerk named Hector Vane and a deed transfer that occurred in November of 1880. Voss went. Not gracefully, but he went. Hector Vane, when confronted separately by post in San Antonio, had already begun to unravel. He was a small, nervous man whose loyalty to Voss had been purchased rather than freely given, and purchased loyalty tends to dissolve under pressure in direct proportion to its original cost. He provided a written statement within 48 hours that confirmed the scheme in enough detail to support both a state and federal fraud charge. The judge who heard the preliminary matter was a circuit judge named Caldwell, who had been brought in from El Paso specifically because every judge resident in Crane County had some financial relationship with Gerald Voss. Caldwell was a methodical man who read every document twice and asked questions that went to the root of things, and when he was done reading Wallace's evidence packet and Vane's statement, he looked across the table at Voss with an expression of comprehensive displeasure. Voss's land claim was denied. His cattle operation on the disputed parcel was ordered to cease. Hector Vane was charged with fraudulent filing and stripped of his position. The full case for criminal prosecution was referred to the appropriate authorities in Austin. Wallace sent Pauline a telegram that said, "Settled in your favor. Judge confirms original plus creek parcel. Voss finished. All legal, coming back Thursday." She sent back a telegram that said, "I know you would. Come for supper." He had read that telegram 3 times standing in the post office, and the woman behind the counter had looked at him with an expression of mild curiosity that he had entirely failed to notice, because he was preoccupied with the distinct possibility that he was in love with Pauline Bristol in a way that had made the last 3 weeks the longest of his life. He came for supper on Thursday. Celestino had made tamales and was very ostentatiously absent from the house when Wallace arrived, which suggested that the old man had opinions about the situation that he was expressing through strategic withdrawal. The table was set. There was a lamp burning. Pauline had put on a blue dress that he had not seen before, dark blue like the sky at the moment just before full dark, and her hair was down in a way it usually was not when she was working, which was most of the time. He sat down, and she served the food and they ate and talked about the case for the first part of the meal, because that was what they had to get through before they could get to anything else, the same way you have to pass through a doorway before you can be in the room beyond it. He told her about Vane's statement and Caldwell's ruling and the federal referral to Austin, and she listened and asked precise questions and understood the answers without needing them simplified, which was one of the things about her that had, from the very beginning, made him feel that the world was a more navigable place than it usually seemed. "So the creek land is mine," she said. It was not a question, but she said it with an edge of wondering that made it sound like something she was still learning the shape of. "Yours," he said. "Clear title, registered with the county, with a note in the federal record about the fraudulent attempt. Anyone who looks at that parcel will see exactly what Voss tried to do, which means no one will attempt anything similar." She looked at her plate for a moment, then she looked up. "I owe you a significant debt," she said. "No," he said, "you don't. I was doing my job, badly and late, which I won't pretend otherwise, but my job. I don't mean for fixing it, I mean for caring that it was fixed. She paused. There's a difference. He understood that perfectly. He had spent a long time in the company of people who performed the motions of care without the substance of it, and he had learned the difference between the two the way you learn most hard things, by feeling the absence of the real version. "Pauline," he said. "Don't apologize again," she said. "I've been thinking about it and the 3 weeks bothers me less than I expected it to. I think I was angrier in that first moment than I actually am upon reflection. I still should have come sooner. Yes. But you came, and you told me the true reason, not just the legal one." She tilted her head slightly. "That mattered more than you probably know." The lamp between them was making its small sound, and outside the September wind was moving through the cedar trees in the way it did in the evenings, a low, steady sound like breathing. "I meant what I said in the field," he said. She met his eyes. "I know you did. I'm not a man who makes declarations easily. I want to be clear about that so you understand this is not something I say without Wallace. Yes. I have thought about you every day for 12 months, she said. "I think that is adequately clear." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Is it?" "Yes," she said, "it is." They sat there in the lamplight with the wind in the cedars and the tamales getting slightly cold between them, and something shifted in the room the way pressure shifts before a storm. Except this was the opposite of a storm. This was the moment after a storm when the air is washed and clear and everything is exactly what it is. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a long time. It was Celestino who, 2 weeks later, made the observation that settled the matter of the future in Wallace's mind, though he did so in the particular way that old men who know exactly what they are doing deliver insights they want to seem casual. He had been mending a bridle near the barn when Wallace rode up and found him, and without looking up from the leather he said, "You know, there was a man who used to live north of here named Denton. He loved a woman in this county for 6 years and never told her. One day she married someone else. Denton moved to New Mexico." He paused. "I understand New Mexico is a very lonely place." Wallace bought a ring in redemption that very afternoon. It was a simple thing, silver with a small turquoise stone, made by a Mescalero Apache jeweler named Kaya who worked out of a shop on the south end of Crockett Street. Turquoise, Kaya told him, was a stone of protection and truth. Wallace thought that was about right. He proposed on a Sunday morning in October in the east pasture where Pauline was checking on her cattle, which had grown from 6 to a more respectable 11 in the past year. She was wearing her work clothes and her hair was braided back, and she had a smear of red mud on her left cheek, and he thought she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen in his life. He got off his horse and he told her he loved her, and he asked her to marry him with the ring box open in his hand and the turquoise catching the morning light. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She said, "Yes," without hesitation, and then she kissed him in the east pasture with the cattle, regarding them with the serene indifference of cattle everywhere, and the moment settled into him like a root finding water. The wedding was held in Redemption on the first Saturday of November, 1882, in the Methodist Church on the Main Street, which was a small white building with a bell that had cracked sometime in the previous decade, and made a sound slightly less musical than it had been designed to make. The preacher was a tall Pennsylvanian named Elmore who had been in the territory 5 years, and who married people with the comfortable efficiency of a man who had done it many times and still believed in the institution. Celestino Rios stood up as Wallace's witness, having taken the role with a dignity that suggested he had been appointed rather than merely asked. The women of Redemption, most of whom had been watching the development of the courtship with the focused interest of people who have few other entertainments, filled the pews on Pauline's side in numbers that indicated her integration into the community had been more complete than she had fully registered. Mrs. Horace from the feed store cried during the vows. Old Franklin Price at the livery, who had come in his Sunday coat, clapped loudest when Elmore pronounced them married. Even Doyle Fitch came, which Wallace considered a minor miracle. Pauline wore a dress of cream-colored wool that she had made herself over the preceding month in the evenings, working by lamplight after the outdoor labor was done. It had small pearl buttons down the front that she had ordered from a dry goods catalog in September. She had sewn them on slowly, one by one, thinking about him while she did it. She walked up the aisle of the small Crackbell church, and she looked at Wallace standing at the front of it with the morning light coming through the single stained glass window falling across his shoulder. And she thought about the first time she had seen him leaning against that barbershop post with the star on his chest, and the hat tilted against the sun. And she thought about all the mornings since then, when he had appeared on her property, and worked beside her, and said nothing unnecessary and everything important. And she understood that what she felt for him was not the soft, uncertain thing she had assumed love would be. It was structural. It was load-bearing. It was the kind of love that holds up the rest of life the way joists hold up a floor. She reached the front of the church. He took her hands. His were warm. She met his eyes and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, there he is. There is the most dependable man in this territory, and he is mine, and I am his, and I meant it every single time. The vows were the traditional ones. They said them to each other slowly and without rushing, and when she got to the word cherish, she held it a moment longer than the word before it, and his hands tightened very slightly on hers, and she knew he had noticed. Elmore pronounced them husband and wife. Wallace kissed her with the warmth and restraint of a man who is acutely aware they are in church, and the congregation laughed with the indulgent affection of people who are genuinely glad for other people's happiness. They drove back to the property in a borrowed buckboard, with ribbons on the reins that Celestino had tied on while they were inside the church. The afternoon was clear and cold, and the mountains to the west were blue-gray against the sky. Pauline sat beside Wallace on the bench with her shoulder against his arm and the wind pulling at the loose strands of her hair, and she felt the specific and extraordinary peace of having arrived somewhere. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a hard one on the range. The freeze came early and hit several of the small operations in the county hard, killing cattle and splitting fence posts and cracking water pipes. Wallace, who retained his deputy's position, spent much of the season helping neighboring ranches deal with the crises that cold weather compresses into short, brutal periods of frantic work. He was gone for stretches of days, riding out to properties whose owners were overwhelmed, and Pauline managed her own operation with Celestino, and with the addition of a second hired hand, a young man of 20 named Roberto, who was Celestino's grandnephew, and who had the same ability to fix anything made of wood or leather, and had additionally not yet had his knees give out. She was not idle in his absence, and she did not require reassurance while he was gone. But she noticed, in the evenings, the particular kind of quiet that the house had without him in it, and she understood that it was not loneliness exactly, but the awareness of a missing element, the way a piece of music has a different quality when one instrument is not present. He always came back when he said he would. That was the thing that was so consistently true about Wallace Mercer that it had become a fact of her life the way sunrise was a fact, not something she worried about, just something she relied on. He said he would be back by Friday, and he was back by Friday. He said the pipe on the north side would hold until spring, and it held until spring. He said Gerald Voss would not bother her again, and Voss, who was awaiting trial in Austin for federal land fraud, had not. In February, sitting by the stove on a cold evening while the wind came off the mountains with a sound like it intended to stay, she realized she was carrying their child. She told him the next morning over coffee, directly, without preamble, because she was a direct woman, and the news seemed to her too important for theatrical build-up. She simply said, "I believe I am expecting. Probably July, I would estimate." He had been in the middle of putting his cup down. He set it down very carefully, and then he looked at her for a moment with an expression that she could only describe as a man arriving at something he had not known he was traveling toward, a destination that was more welcome than he had prepared himself for. He got up from the table and came around to her side and put his arms around her from behind, his face against the side of her head, and he did not say anything for a long time. She could feel his breathing change. She put her hands over his arms. "You feel about that the way I feel about it?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said, "I believe I do." Celestino, when told the news, produced from somewhere on his person a small carved wooden figure of a mother and child that he had apparently been carrying with him for this occasion, which suggested either remarkable foresight or that he had known before they had. He pressed it into Pauline's hand with a solemnity that indicated the depth of his investment in the family he had attached himself to. The spring of 1883 was easier than the winter had been. The grass came back on the range with the generosity that good rainfall brings to West Texas, and Pauline's cattle operation, now numbering 15 head with a bull she had purchased in March, was doing better than she had projected in her most optimistic calculations. She had begun selling to the Redemption butcher and had a standing arrangement with a hotel in the county seat that was consistent enough to be called reliable income. She expanded the house that spring with the help of Wallace and Roberto, and 2 men from town who owed Wallace favors. They added a room off the back with a window that faced east, for the morning light, and a wooden floor that was level, which Pauline had insisted on with the firmness of someone who has spent time in rooms with uneven floors and has views about it. The room was intended for a child. They furnished it with a small wooden cradle that a cabinet maker in Redemption built to Wallace's specifications, a low chest of drawers, and a rocking chair that had belonged to Celestino's wife, who had died many years before, and which Celestino brought over on a wagon one afternoon and set down in the corner with the expression of a man completing a long-held intention. "For rocking," he said, as if this required clarification. "Thank you, Celestino," Pauline said. He nodded once and went back to his work. The summer of 1883 arrived in West Texas with the particular insistence of West Texas summers, which is to say that the heat was large and total, and the sky was white at noon, and the shadows of the mountains moved across the land with a slowness that made you aware of time in a way that ordinary days did not. Pauline managed the heat with the practicality she brought to all physical inconveniences, which was to acknowledge it, accommodate it, and continue functioning. On the 14th of July, during an afternoon thunderstorm that arrived from the southwest with more drama than the previous 3 weeks of clear weather had suggested was coming, she told Wallace it was time. The doctor in Redemption was a woman named Catherine Marsh, who had come to the territory from Ohio 3 years earlier with a medical degree from a Philadelphia college and a complete indifference to the opinions of people who found female physicians surprising. She had delivered roughly a third of the children born in Crane County in the past 2 years and had strong views about cleanliness and practical approaches to difficult situations that Pauline found deeply compatible with her own philosophy. Catherine arrived at the property within the hour, riding through the tail end of the rain with her medical bag strapped to her saddle, with the efficiency of someone who had done exactly this in exactly these conditions. She sent Wallace to the front porch with the calm authority of someone who has learned that the most effective management of anxious husbands is spatial. Wallace sat on the front porch in the damp post-storm air while the labor progressed and listened to the sounds from inside the house with the focused, helpless attention of a man who is accustomed to being useful and has been placed in a situation where there is nothing useful he can do. He held his hat in his hands. He watched the clouds move east over the mountains. He thought about the fact that on the other side of the wall of the house that was his home, the woman he loved better than his own continuation was doing the hardest possible work, and that there was nothing on earth he could do about any of it except wait and be available to whatever came next. Celestino came and sat with him partway through the evening, not saying anything, just sitting. That was sufficient. At 8:47 in the evening, by the clock on the fireplace mantel, Catherine Marsh came to the front door and told Wallace he had a son. He stood up so fast he knocked over the chair behind him. The child was healthy and substantial, and had arrived with a powerful opinion about the indignity of being born, which he expressed at volume for a solid 10 minutes before settling into the comparative quiet of being held. He had Wallace's gray eyes and Pauline's dark hair, and his hands were already so complete and formed that Wallace stood looking at them for a full minute while Catherine finished her work and Celestino heated water in the kitchen. "He is everything," Wallace said to Pauline, who was lying back against the pillow with the kind of exhausted radiance that comes from having done the most difficult thing a human body can do and come out the other side of it. "He is," she agreed. "He is the most demanding thing I have ever met in my life, and I love him extraordinarily." They named him Arthur James Mercer. Arthur for her uncle, whose land had started all of it, whose memory she carried with the particular complexity of people we did not know well enough to grieve simply, but who left us something real regardless. James for Wallace's father, a man who had homesteaded in the Texas Hill Country in the 1850s and had been dead for 10 years, but who Wallace still thought of when he needed to remember what it looked like to carry difficulty without being diminished by it. Arthur James came into the world in July 1883 and immediately restructured everything around him, which is what babies do, and which the Mercer household accommodated with varying degrees of grace. Wallace took to fatherhood with the same steady attention he gave everything, which meant he was up in the night when the baby cried without being asked, and could be found in the pre-dawn dark walking the length of the front room with the child against his shoulder, murmuring things too quiet to distinguish, which Pauline, watching from the doorway, thought was the most privately beautiful thing she had ever witnessed in her life. Celestino, for his part, became the child's devoted shadow the moment Arthur was old enough to be put on a blanket in the sun near the barn. He would sit on his stool nearby and carve things from mesquite wood and narrate the activities of the ranch to the infant in a low, continuous Spanish that seemed to produce in the child a state of profound contentment. The criminal case against Gerald Voss concluded in Austin in October of 1883. Voss was convicted of federal land fraud and sentenced to 5 years. Hector Vane received a lesser sentence in exchange for his cooperation and was required to make financial restitution to any parties affected by fraudulent filings he had processed during his tenure, a category that included a surprising number of people beyond Pauline and pointed to the breadth of Voss's operations. Pauline heard the news by telegram on a Tuesday morning and read it twice before she set it on the table. She was nursing Arthur at the time, who was 3 months old and had strong views about interruptions to the process. She let him finish before she went to find Wallace, who was mending tack in the barn. "Voss is convicted," she said. 5 years. He straightened up. "Good," he said. "Is that enough?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "It's what the law gives," he said. "And the law giving something is more than a lot of people in this territory get." She understood that. The law was imperfect, frequently delayed, and sometimes incomplete. But the alternative was a territory where only the most powerful decided the shape of things, and she had seen enough of what that looked like to know it was worse. "Voss's cattle operation," she said, "the parts of it on legitimate land. It'll be sold off to pay the legal costs in Vane's restitution fund. Most likely. The creek parcel, my creek parcel, I'd like to expand there in the spring. Another structure, more water access for the cattle." He smiled. It was the smile she loved best, the one that was less about what was funny and more about what was right. "I'll help you survey it." "I know you will," she said, and she said it the way she had said it on the porch that first September, with the weight of genuine belief behind it. He looked at her for a moment in the barn light, with the smell of hay and leather and the distant sound of Arthur making the sounds he made when he was awake and working out the mechanics of existence. "I love you," he said. It was not the first time he had said it since the wedding, but he said it with a particular directness in that moment, as if he were clarifying something. "I know," she said. "I love you also. Now come and hold your son because my arms are asleep." The following years in redemption were good years, in the particular way that good years are built out of accumulated small things rather than single large events. Pauline's cattle operation grew steadily, reaching 40 head by the end of 1884, and turning enough profit that she could hire a third hand and stop losing sleep over the margin between income and expenses. The creek parcel was developed as she had planned, with a secondary water structure and an expanded grazing area that made the whole operation more resilient than it had been when it was limited to the original land. Wallace was elected county sheriff in the spring of 1884, defeating the incumbent in an election that was, by the standards of West Texas elections, remarkably undramatic. His opponent had been in office for 12 years and had the comfortable assumption of a man who has not been meaningfully challenged in that time, and he had underestimated the degree to which the county's population had grown and changed in the recent years of settlement, and was looking for something different. Wallace ran on reliability, which everyone who voted for him agreed was exactly what they already knew him to be, and he won by a margin that surprised him and surprised no one else. The star on his chest went from a deputy's 5-point to a sheriff's circle, and the change seemed to affect him mainly in the sense that his responsibilities increased, and he was therefore, if possible, busier than he had been before. Pauline attended the swearing-in ceremony at the courthouse with Arthur on her hip, the child being 14 months old at that point, and possessed of a robust interest in everything he was not supposed to touch, which in a courthouse included most things. She stood in the back of the room and watched Wallace put his hand on a Bible and swear to uphold the laws of Crane County and the state of Texas, and she felt the same thing she had felt watching him in the church on their wedding day, the conviction that she was watching a person being exactly what they were, completely and without pretense. After the ceremony, when people were congratulating him and shaking his hand in the way people do at public occasions, she made her way through to where he was standing and she looked up at him and she said, quietly, just for him, "The most dependable man in the territory. Still true." He looked down at her with the gray eyes that she had been looking at for 3 years and he said, just as quietly, "Only because you believe it." "I believe it," she said, "because it's true. Those are different things." He smiled. Arthur, from her hip, reached out and grabbed the new sheriff's badge with both hands and attempted to determine whether it was edible. Wallace gently extracted it from his son's grip, and the three of them stood there in the late afternoon light of the Crane County Courthouse, while people moved around them with their congratulations and their handshakes, and the family they had made out of land and law and honesty and love was whole and present and entirely itself. The spring of 1885 brought new settlers to the region in numbers that the previous years had not seen, pushed west by drought in the Central Plains, and drawn by the increasingly legible promise of the Pecos River country. Redemption grew. A second general store opened. A school was established in a building that had previously been a failed saloon, which the town council considered a satisfactory conversion. The Methodist Church repaired its cracked bell, finally, and the sound it made thereafter was proper and full, and on the first Sunday after the repair the congregation stood and sang with the particular joy that comes from a long-standing imperfection being corrected. Pauline was on the school board from the beginning, appointed in March, and immediately the most organized presence in a body that needed organization. She had opinions about the curriculum that were based on her own experience of what educated and what did not, and she expressed them with the direct clarity that was her nature. And the board found, as most people who worked with Pauline Bristol Mercer found, that her directness was so obviously in service of the actual goal that it was easy to follow even when it was not easy to hear. She was also, by April of that year, pregnant with their second child. This time she was less precise about the calculation when she told him, partly because she was more experienced in the general territory of expecting a child, and partly because Arthur was by now a walking, talking, largely unstoppable presence in the household who absorbed a significant portion of the planning attention that had been available in greater quantity the first time. "I think February," she said, over supper in May. "But it could be March." Wallace looked up from his plate with the same expression he had had the first time, the look of arriving at a destination more welcome than expected, though this time mixed with the additional dimension of a man who also has a 2-year-old in the house and is doing the arithmetic of how that will go. "February," he repeated, "or March. All right. Are you alarmed?" "No," he said. "I am." He paused, and she could see him searching for the right word with the seriousness he brought to language when precision mattered, grateful, profoundly, and a little mathematical. She laughed. "The ranch can manage another person." "The ranch can absolutely manage another person," he agreed. "It's Arthur's opinion of the matter I'm not sure of." Arthur was apprised of the situation as the months progressed, in the simplified but not dishonest terms appropriate for a 2-year-old. His response to the information varied depending on the day and his mood, ranging from delighted interest in the concept of a baby to a period in October when he became convinced the baby was going to take his wooden horse carved by Celestino, which required some careful diplomatic work. By the time the baby actually arrived, in a bitter cold stretch of February 1886 that had the Davis Mountains white with snow, and the cistern iced over 2 mornings in a row, Arthur had fully committed to the role of older brother with the particular combination of possessiveness and protectiveness that the position requires. The second child was a girl. She arrived on the 9th of February in the same room where her brother had been born, attended by Catherine Marsh, who had by now delivered enough babies in Crane County that she moved through the process with the combined authority and efficiency of long practice. She was smaller than Arthur had been, but, Catherine assured them, perfectly and completely healthy, and she came into the world more quietly than her brother, opening her eyes immediately and looking at everything with the focused, evaluating attention of someone who intends to take a comprehensive inventory. "She has your eyes," Wallace said. Pauline looked at her daughter's dark eyes regarding the ceiling of the room with that extraordinary new-person focus. "She has her own eyes," she said. "They just look like mine right now." They named her Ruth Elena Mercer. Ruth for the biblical quality of steadfastness that both of them admired, and that seemed already implicit in the child's expression. Elena for Catherine Marsh's own mother, because Catherine had delivered both of their children and had become, in the process, something closer to family than professional, and naming a daughter partly for someone seemed to Pauline like the most honest possible expression of gratitude. Catherine, when told, said, "You didn't have to do that," with a brevity that covered considerable emotion. "We know," Pauline said. "We did it anyway." Arthur was introduced to Ruth on a February afternoon with the snow still on the mountains, and the light coming through the east window of the new room in the particular way winter afternoon light does, clear and level and without sentiment. He stood beside the cradle and looked at his sister for a long time. "She is very small," he said. "You are also very small," Wallace told him. "I am not small now," Arthur said, with the dignity of a 2.5-year-old who has recently graduated to larger boots. "No," Wallace said. "You're not." Arthur considered his sister for another moment. Then he put one careful finger on her hand where it lay on the blanket, very gently, the way Celestino had taught him to approach the horses, slowly and without fuss. Ruth's fingers curled around his, reflexively, as new babies do. Something in Arthur's face changed in a way that Pauline, watching from the rocking chair, recognized as the moment a person understands that they love something they did not expect to love. "All right," Arthur said, in the satisfied tone of someone who has made a decision. "She can stay." Celestino, from the doorway, made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been something else entirely, and turned away before anyone could determine which. The years between 1886 and 1889 were the years the territory became a country, by which Pauline meant that the infrastructure of permanence established itself in the Crane County region in ways that made it feel less like an outpost and more like a place. The railroad came within 30 miles of Redemption in 1887, which changed the economics of cattle ranching in the county in fundamental ways, shortening the distance between production and market and making operations like Pauline's significantly more viable. She expanded to 65 head in 1887 and began supplying a cattle buyer in the county seat who sold to buyers in San Antonio, which meant that her operation was now connected, however distantly, to the larger national market. Wallace's tenure as sheriff was defined by the careful, undramatic competence that his election had promised. He dealt with the ordinary business of frontier law enforcement, the disputes between neighbors, the occasional violent incident that the combination of whiskey and close quarters and hard circumstances produced, the steadily more complex legal landscape that accompanied increasing settlement and increasing assertion of federal and state authority over a territory that had previously operated on more informal arrangements. He was respected by the people he worked for, and, which was perhaps more meaningful, by the people he occasionally worked against, who found in him the consistency that made even an adversarial interaction have a certain integrity. He also, increasingly, was involved in the conversations about what kind of territory, and eventually what kind of state Texas was going to be. These were not simple conversations. The questions of land, water, labor, and law that had organized themselves around the conflict with Voss were part of a larger pattern of conflict between established large interests and smaller settlers, and the resolution of individual cases like Pauline's did not resolve the pattern. Wallace was not a politician, but he was a man who thought carefully about justice, and he was increasingly aware that careful thought about justice had implications beyond the individual case. He talked to Pauline about these things in the evenings, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, and she listened and thought and responded with the kind of engagement that had always been one of the things he loved most about her. The capacity to hold complexity without collapsing it into something simpler than it actually was. "The smaller settlers," she said one evening in 1888, when they had been talking about a particular water rights dispute in the southern part of the county, "they don't have the legal resources to fight these things the way we did. We had you. We had Sutter. We had the federal machinery moving in the right direction at the right time. Most people don't get that combination." "No," he said. "Is there something to be done about that structurally? Some mechanism that doesn't depend on the particular circumstances happening to align?" He was quiet for a moment. "There are people in Austin thinking about that. Land commissions, water boards with actual enforcement authority. It's slow and it's imperfect, and the people with the most money will always find ways to make the process serve them better than it serves everyone else. But the direction of it matters." "Then the direction matters," she said. "Keep pushing on the direction." He looked at her across the table with the same expression he had had many times across many years, the expression of a man who is consistently surprised by how much better his life is for having this specific person in it. "You should be in those conversations," he said. "In Austin. I have 65 cattle and 2 children and a school board that cannot agree on whether geography should be taught before or after arithmetic," she said. "Austin can wait." He smiled. "Geography first," he said. "You can't do arithmetic if you don't know where you are." She laughed and threw a dish towel at him, and he caught it. And the evening concluded the way their evenings generally concluded, in the easy warmth of people who have been through things together and have come out the other side of them, and have built something real on the ground of the experience. The final significant thing that the story requires telling happened in the autumn of 1889, when Texas was being considered for admission to the Union as a state in the formal sense, which raised the question of how the existing territorial law would be absorbed into state structure, and what would happen to the land claims that had been established under territorial provisions. A lawyer arrived in redemption from Austin named Jonas Webb, who was working for the State Land Commission on the inventory and verification of existing property claims in the region. He was a thin, efficient man with wire-rimmed glasses and a quality of focused inquiry that reminded Pauline of a good accountant. He came to the property with a surveyor and spent 2 days reviewing Pauline's deed, the records of the Voss case, the federal land office notation, and the physical boundaries of the property. At the end of his review, he told her that her title was among the most thoroughly documented and legally defended property claims he had encountered in the course of his survey, which was a compliment he delivered with the dry appreciation of a man who has been looking at badly documented claims for several months. The Voss case, he said, created a precedent that will actually help us in the conversion to state property law. The principle that a fraudulent addition to a deed does not invalidate the legitimate underlying claim is something we'd been needing an adjudicated case for. I'm glad the experience was useful to someone, Pauline said, with only slight irony. Webb looked at her over his glasses with an expression that suggested he had more layers than the dry efficiency implied. It's been useful to a fair number of people who will never know your name, he said. For what it's worth. She thought about that after he left. She thought about the way that justice works when it works, not in grand moments of resolution, but in the slow accumulation of precedent and practice, the way water shapes stone, not all at once but over time and by persistence. She thought about Arthur Bristol, who had come to a dry piece of West Texas in 1876 and sunk a well and named a creek and started something that he did not live to see complete. She thought about Celestino, who had attached himself to her operation from the first week and had been part of the foundation of everything built since. She thought about Catherine Marsh, who had delivered her children and become family. She thought about the people in redemption who had filled the pews at her wedding and who said hello to her on Crockett Street and whose lives intersected with hers in the 1,000 small ways that constitute community. She thought about Wallace, who had come to stand beside her at a barbershop post in the spring of 1881 with his hat tilted and his star slightly crooked, and had told her the truth about her property line when he could have said nothing, and who had kept on telling her the truth since, even when it was hard, and who was at that moment at his desk in the sheriff's office reading Jonas Webb's preliminary survey report, and she was certain, making careful notes in the margin. She went inside and started making supper. Arthur came in behind her, mud-covered from the field in the way 8-year-olds are mud-covered as a matter of principle, and Ruth, who was 3 and had strong opinions about being wherever her brother was, came in behind him. Celestino could be heard outside talking to the horses in Spanish. The stove was warm. The light through the kitchen window was the long golden light of October afternoon. Wallace came home at the time he said he would. He always did. She heard his horse in the yard and heard him speak to Celestino, a brief exchange she could not make out from inside, and then his steps on the porch and the door, and he came in with the cold air still on his coat and the fading light on his face, and he looked at her across the kitchen with the look that she had been on the receiving end of for nearly 8 years now, and that still did the same thing to her chest that it had done the very first time she registered it, which was to make her feel, with total clarity, that she was in the right place. How was Webb, he asked. Thorough, she said. He said our title is well documented. He'd be right about that. He also said the Voss case set a precedent that will help with the conversion to state law. He came to the kitchen, and she turned from the stove, and he put his arms around her, and she put her hands against his chest, and they stood like that for a moment in the warm kitchen while Arthur could be heard in the back of the house, explaining something to Ruth in the authoritative tones of older siblings. And the stove ticked, and outside Celestino was finishing up the evening work with the horses. We built something here, she said. We did, he agreed. I want to say something to you, and I want you to actually hear it and not be modest about it. He looked down at her with slight wariness and considerable affection. "All right. You are the most dependable man I have ever known," she said. "Not in the way people say it when they mean you show up on time and fix things. In the way that matters. In the way that means you are the same person in the dark as you are in the light, and the same person to people who can help you as to people who cannot, and the same person on the worst day as on the best one. I have known that since I stood on a porch and said it the first time, and it has not become less true by being more familiar. It has become more true." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I spent a long time before you thinking that dependability was a quality that was useful to other people. And now I know it's only real when there's someone who sees it," he said. "You made it real, you believed it and you meant it, and that turned it from a habit into something worth being." She reached up and took his face in her hands. "You would have been it regardless," she said. "I just told you. That's the whole thing, Pauline, telling someone and meaning it. That's the whole thing." She kissed him then in the warm kitchen with the stove and the children and the old man with the horses and the whole accumulated weight of their life pressing up around them like the land itself, solid and real and earned. Ruth came into the kitchen at that moment, as 3-year-olds do, with no awareness of or interest in timing, and stood at their legs demanding to know when supper would be ready. Wallace picked her up and she grabbed his sheriff's badge, which she did every time, and attempted to determine whether it was edible, which she also did every time. And Pauline went back to the stove, and Arthur came in from the back, and Celestino knocked on the door to say good night before heading to his own quarters in the small building near the barn. And the ordinary evening assembled itself around them the way ordinary evenings do. Later, when the children were in their beds and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch the way they had sat on a porch in September 1881, with coffee growing cold between them and the mountains dark against the dark sky. The night was clear and cold, and the stars over the Davis Mountains were the extraordinary West Texas stars, dense and close, and without the interference of any competing light. "We should think about the spring," she said. "I want to add another 10 head, and the school board is pushing for a reading room attached to the building, which I think is worth doing. The water structure on the creek parcel needs some attention before the dry season," he said. "I can have Roberto look at it in March. Celestino's knees were bothering him this week. I noticed. I'll talk to him about slowing down on the morning chores. He won't like it." "He won't like it at all," she agreed. They sat with the coffee and the stars and the quiet and the particular peace of two people who have learned to live inside the same life settled over them. "What do you want?" he asked. It was not a practical question. The tone of it was not directed at spring cattle counts or water structures. She thought about it honestly as she thought about everything. "This," she said, "more of exactly this. More years, more children if they come. Ruth and Arthur growing up on this land. Celestino at his stool for as many more years as his knees allow him. More evenings like this." "That's a reasonable list," he said. "What do you want?" He looked out at the mountains, the shapes of them against the stars. "The same," he said. "Every day of it I can get." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were very bright, and the land around them was their land, legitimately and without question, the creek and the original acres and the fields where the cattle were, and the house where their children were sleeping. All of it earned and defended and built by two people who had found each other in the middle of all the beautiful difficulty of a territory becoming a place where people lived. He was the most dependable man in the territory. She had told him so, more than once, in more than one kind of moment. She had been the only one who had ever said it directly to him, looked him in the eye with nothing between them and meant every syllable of it. And that, as it turned out, had been the beginning of everything. The years continued to build themselves on that foundation with the generosity that good foundations make possible. In 1891, Celestino Rios passed peacefully in his sleep in his quarters near the barn, at an age he himself estimated at somewhere between 70 and 75. the precision of his birth year having been lost to circumstance in the way that many things were lost in that era. He left no family closer than Roberto, and it was Wallace and Pauline and their children who stood at the grave in the property's small cemetery, in the ground that had been Pauline's uncle's and was now theirs, and said goodbye to the man who had been their foundation in a different way than the land, more human and more irreplaceable. Roberto, who had been with them since 1883, took over the management of the barn operations with a quiet authority that indicated he had been preparing for the role for some time. He had by then his own small house on the eastern edge of the property, built with Wallace's help in the summer of 1888, and his own life within the larger life of the ranch, and he was, in his way, as much a part of the place as any of them. Arthur was 11 in 1891, and already visibly his father's son in the way he moved through the world, methodical and warm, and with the particular quality of paying full attention that made people feel, when he was listening to them, that what they were saying mattered. He was also his mother's son in the mathematical precision that he brought to problems and in the directness with which he said the thing he meant. Ruth, at 5, was herself completely, which was to say she was a force of nature in the form of a small girl with Pauline's eyes and her own opinions about everything, and she had a quality of determined inquiry that Catherine Marsh, who visited regularly as a friend and occasional medical authority, described as the most alarming intelligence I have seen in a child under 10, and I say that as a compliment. Texas became a state in 1890, and the conversion of territorial law to state law proceeded with the expected combination of clarity and confusion. But Pauline's property came through the transition with every claim intact and several of Webb's structural improvements to the Land Commission, making the process cleaner for small settlers than it had been in the preceding years. Wallace served his 4th term as Crane County Sheriff in 1892 and began, with Pauline's full support and considerable organizational assistance, to think seriously about what came after the badge. There was work to be done in Austin. There was work to be done at the level where patterns were addressed rather than individual incidents, and he had the experience and the credibility, and importantly, the person beside him to make that work possible. By the end of 1892, the property was fully what Pauline had imagined on that stagecoach from San Antonio in the spring of 1881, when she had held a deed in her hand and believed in the future it represented. It was more than she had imagined, because imagination at 26, however strong, does not have access to everything that life will actually provide. It does not have access to Wallace Mercer leaning against a barbershop post with his star at a slight angle. It does not have access to a child's fingers curling around a sibling's in a cradle in the East Room. It does not have access to the specific quality of West Texas starlight on a cold, clear evening with coffee growing cold and the mountains dark against the sky and the future open and good ahead of them. She sat on the porch on a December evening with the heater burning inside and the children doing their lessons at the kitchen table and Wallace beside her. And she thought about all of it, the betrayal that had been waiting in the ground of her inheritance, and the man who had found it and brought it into the light where it could be dealt with, and the love that had grown out of the doing of hard things together, and the life they were living which was not perfect because nothing is but which was true, which was the standard she had always held everything to. She looked at him, he was looking at the mountains. Wallace, he looked at her. Thank you, she said, for being what you are. He smiled. Thank you for knowing what that is. She took his hand. He held hers. The mountains were dark and enormous and the stars were beginning to appear at the top of the sky, the first ones always there before you noticed them, and the year was ending and another was coming, and everything was exactly what it was, which was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. And in Redemption, Texas, as the winter of 1892 settled over the Davis Mountains, and the cattle were gathered close against the cold, and the children's lamplight fell yellow through the kitchen window into the dark. The most dependable man in the territory sat on a porch with his wife, who was the only person who had ever told him so and meant it, and they held hands in the cold, clear night, and they were home.